Here we go. So it is my utter pleasure. I can't tell you how happy I am to have Aaron here. He completed his PhD at Northeastern University, and he studied concurrency, language design, and program verification during his academic career, topics that are personally very close to my heart. He then joined Mozilla to work on Rust, which he helped lead through its first 2 editions. And he currently works as an engineer at Fastly, bringing together language technology via WebAssembly and internet infrastructure, edge computing. So Aaron, please take it away. And thank you once again for joining us. I'm really looking forward to it all. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So my talk's actually recorded. I'm going to try to share the screen, and please just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you get the audio with it once I share.
Of course. I don't hear anything, any audio from the talk, but maybe some of the others, any of the co-hosts can hear it.
Not me.
Not me either.
Okay, just a second. Let me
Sure.
share sound. There we go. All right, let me try this again. Hi. My name is Aaron Turon, and I'm so excited to be part of PLMW this year. I've been involved with this workshop in a number of ways over the years, as an attendee, as a panelist, and as a speaker. But I think this year feels different, and not just because we're not meeting in person, but because this talk is really different from talks I've given in the past. It's a deeply personal one. I was really glad to be invited to come and talk a bit about mental health in the context of, grad school or academic work, and specifically to this audience that's so close to my heart. So I want to start with a bit of background about myself so that you can understand where I'm coming from and how it might connect to some of your experiences or plans. So I was once a grad student. I got my PhD from Northeastern University, working on language design, concurrency, and verification. And then I went on to do a postdoc with Derek Dreyer at MPI. I was pretty successful academically. After my postdoc, I had lined up quite a number of faculty interviews at top universities and research labs. But I ultimately decided to change directions toward industrial research and joined Mozilla, where I worked on Rust for a number of years and ended up leading the team there at Mozilla, as well as being a community leader for the Rust community, seeing Rust through its first 2 editions. And most recently, I've been working at Fastly, where we're using Rust together with another language technology called WebAssembly to build some exciting new internet infrastructure. Now, on paper, this all sounds like a very exciting and successful career, and it is, but there's another side to this whole story. Part of the reason that I ended up moving away from the academic path is that when I began the process of faculty interviews, I more or less had a mental breakdown and ended up canceling my interviews and scrambling to change directions. Later, with my time in Rust, some similar things happened. I experienced a lot of burnout and eventually was unable to continue working the way that I had been in the community. During my grad school years, I more and more often experienced intense anxiety and depression. And after leaving academia and working at Mozilla, these became pretty steady parts of my life. But even though my journey into mental illness has been ongoing really for my whole life, but especially through my academic career, it's only been in the last 3 years that I've really made a concerted effort to start to understand mental health and take steps to really improve my quality of life and tackle these issues head on. So that's where I'm coming from. And I've made a ton of progress over these last 3 years. I've learned more than I could possibly summarize in a 30-minute talk, but my hope for today is to share some of the key ideas that have been most helpful in understanding my own mind and beginning to get a handle on my suffering, and just kind of raise awareness of the kinds of issues that can come up and what kinds of steps you can take to get help for yourself. Now, there are a lot of different entry points into psychology and mental health, but the thing that I'm going to focus on today is emotions. I remember when I was in high school, I thought that feelings were very important, and I spent a lot of time and energy in my feelings and talking to people about my feelings. But as I progressed into college and grad school and began my career, I found my orientation toward feelings slowly shifting. I started to think of feelings as a kind of obstacle, really, to doing the kind of thinking work that I wanted to do, interrupting my concentration or sapping my energy. But to be more specific, it was the sort of bad feelings that I was frustrated by. Why do I feel this sadness? Why do I feel this anxiety? Why can't I just focus on the things I'm trying to focus on? And growing up, I heard a lot of different messages about feelings. My dad used to be a huge fan of the Bobby McFerrin song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." And deep into my academic career, that was what I was striving for. All of these negative feelings that I encountered just seemed like distractions from the career and life that I was trying to build, and I couldn't really see any purpose for them. I think more generally, I was part of a culture that had suspicion toward emotions in general. Of course, there's the unpleasant parts of emotions, but beyond that, emotions can be unpredictable. You can't control them, and they often seem disconnected from what's actually going on, or disproportionate responses to what's happening. And moreover, if we're not careful, if we just act directly on what we're feeling, we often do things that we regret. That particular kind of suspicion toward feelings has a long history in Western culture. So here I have a quote from David Hume's Treatise on Human Nature back in 1739. And even in that point, he was observing how common it was to sort of pit feelings, or what he refers to as passion, against reason or rationality, and to sort of say that reason should take precedence, that it's going to lead you in the right ways in life, and that passion is something to be kind of controlled by reason. It's interesting to bring that into connection with working in computing. In some sense, computing represents the ultimate in rationality, right? The whole point is that computers are predictable and controllable and rational, and anything that's not in computing is ultimately down to human error. It sort of reeks of emotion and fallibility. And for me, I think one of the draws of computing was that predictability and controllability, that it felt like something I could really understand and grapple with, unlike my emotional life. But to go back to Hume for a second, writing again back in 1739, he makes the case that things should be the other way around, that reason should actually serve the passions. And to try to summarize his argument, it's basically saying that reason can help you figure out how to get what you want, but it's never going to tell you what you want. And it's interesting that you can translate this kind of thinking directly over to computing, right? No matter how much we study the lambda calculus or explore language design, that's never going to tell us what programs we want to write or should be writing. So the point is that feelings have an important role to play, even the difficult or negative feelings. And the way that I think about this is that fundamentally, feelings tend to either draw us toward something or push us away from something. They're impulses that set us in motion. And those impulses are part of how we know who we are, right? They are driven by needs like hunger or relationship. They can reflect our values, like wanting to be kind or just. And they're informed by our past, by all the experiences we've had, perhaps past betrayals or tragedy. You know, and I was talking before about how I came to have this view of feelings as getting in the way of work or interrupting my flow. But that's part of the role of feelings, is to draw our attention and direct our energy to the things that are important to us, that we need or need to keep ourselves safe from. And then there's this last point, which maybe feels a bit hokey, but I think is really important, which is that feelings are how we ultimately experience our life, how we're able to be inside of our life story and not just reasoning logically about it. So our feelings are very, very important, and they are meant to reflect our interests, but nevertheless, we do often struggle against our feelings, struggle to understand them, struggle to tolerate them, right? All of those negative aspects that I mentioned about feelings before are often true in our lives. So how do we make sense of this tension between the important positive roles that feelings are sort of meant to play and our often frustrating struggles with feelings? Well, since this is not in front of a live audience, I don't know whether you laughed at my previous slide talking about computing being perfectly rational, but I think we all know that in practice, computing systems often end up being quite irrational. And I want to draw a kind of analogy between what goes on in the mind and what goes on in computing in practice. On the one hand, there's a sort of very rational core to computing, to the ideas of a machine and writing a simple program that runs directly on a machine in isolation. But in reality, we've built large systems on top of these rational mechanisms. And those large systems tend to kind of accrete irrationality over time. And that can show up in a lot of really familiar ways. There's a notion of technical debt, where we know that things are not set up quite in the best way right now, but we need to keep going. And so we keep this less than ideal structure in the code. And over time, that structure gets more and more ossified and harder to change. And so there's this deeply embedded mismatch in the system that we're writing. Systems often have outdated assumptions about other systems they're interacting with or parts of the world. Again, those assumptions can become deeply embedded and hard to change. Systems can have inconsistencies and bugs. They can deal with old ideas in the forms of legacy APIs or protocols. And at the end of the day, this can all add up to unpredictable and hard to explain system behaviors. And so the key point I'm trying to make here is that our feelings of frustration, our sense of irrationality around emotions, are not so much about the core concept or mechanisms of emotions. They're really about the emotional baggage that has developed over time, in much the same way that legacy code or technical debt or other things arise in computer systems and lead to a sense of irrationality there. And so I think it can be helpful to try to start from a kind of blank slate or an ideal version of how the mind might work and think about how we move away from that and how we might move closer to it. So one way to think about that is to break down the mind into several interacting subsystems. We have our ongoing thoughts and feelings. We have our decisions that lead to behaviors. We also have our beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about what's important or the story that we're telling. All of these things exist within our own mind. And of course, that mind is embedded in a larger reality. And so from this view, what we're looking for is for all of these systems, including reality, to relate to each other in a sort of harmonious way, where there's some alignment between each of the systems, and things that are happening in one system dynamically impact the other systems in a sort of appropriate way. So let's make this concrete with an example. Imagine that you're a grad student in a research lab, and you have a fellow student that you're friends with, Susan, and a postdoc in the lab, Nick, that you're doing some work with. One day you happen to overhear an interaction between Nick and Susan where Nick makes a remark about Susan's appearance, and you notice that this doesn't land particularly well for Susan, but she doesn't say anything. The conversation just kind of moves on. So that's what happens in reality. And probably the first thing that happens inside of you is some feelings. You maybe feel angry or uncomfortable. And those feelings probably reflect some beliefs or values that you might have about colleagues making inappropriate remarks. Those feelings might start to lead to some thoughts. Maybe I should say something to Nick. When you think that thought, you get some additional feelings. You start feeling afraid. That feeling reflects a different value, which is that you care about your career and your safety, and confronting Nick about what happened might put some of that at jeopardy. That feeling might in turn lead to more thoughts. You can use your reason to game out what might happen if you took certain steps. What might the results be? And then back to your feelings to see how does that weigh against what you care about, until ultimately you reach a decision and choose a behavior. So it's important to notice here that an event in reality caused a kind of cascade of interactions between these different systems of the mind. And that cascade included feelings that might seem contradictory, right? There's anger, there's an impulse toward action, and then a counter impulse of fear trying to keep you from acting. And part of my point here is that those are both very valid things to feel in this situation. They both reflect beliefs and values that you might have. Those beliefs and values just happen to be in tension in this situation. And to make a healthy decision, it's good to be able to experience that full range of feeling and reflect on those feelings, think about the implications, and ultimately come to your decision. So that's the ideal. But getting to and staying at that ideal requires emotional health, and that's going to be the topic of the rest of the talk. When I talk about emotional health, what I mean is the idea that when you experience a feeling, most of the time, you're able to tolerate that feeling enough to remain aware of it, not push it away, to listen to what it's telling you, and then to consciously choose how you're going to respond to it. And you can see the connection between these things and the system that I was just describing, bouncing back and forth between feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and ultimately actions. Emotional health is something that we can't sustain completely on our own. It's fundamentally social. Feelings can sometimes be overwhelming, and in those times, connecting to another person, venting your feelings to them, receiving validation and compassion about your feelings can be a key way to ultimately tolerate, metabolize, and consciously respond to your feelings. You can't do it all on your own. And that is especially true in childhood, where your brain literally lacks the full capacity for regulating emotion and processing it on your own. So it's helpful actually to start with how things look in childhood, how parents might respond to childhood situations that come up, and how that informs our emotional health later in life. So I'll start with a very typical kind of thing that happens with kids. They're running, they fall down, they scrape their knee. And if you've ever spent time with small children, you'll notice that when this happens, before the child reacts in any particular way, they tend to first look to their parents for guidance on how they should feel and how they should react. And those moments of parenting really inform the child's responses later on in life, all the way into adulthood. So let me lay out a kind of ideal response that a parent might make in this situation and how that connects to emotional health. And then we'll look at some less than ideal responses and where those can lead. So in the ideal response, a parent might begin by saying, "You're crying. I think you're scared and sad. That makes sense. It must have hurt. You can come snuggle with me. And when you're ready, we can talk about it." Each of these sentences represents an important step in processing an emotion in an emotionally healthy way. The first step is just to notice that there's a feeling. Feelings happen within our body. And so the first thing we notice is a bodily response, whether that's crying, whether it's tension in our shoulders, or a feeling in our gut. So noticing our body reactions is the first step. Then we can name the feeling that we're experiencing, which begins to separate us out from that feeling a bit, make it a bit less overwhelming by something that we can look at and give a name to: scared, hurt, sad, angry. Once we've named those feelings, we can start to bring our thoughts into context. We can validate why the feelings are happening and that they make sense. Once we have that validation in hand, we're ready to be soothed, to let the feeling attenuate a little bit and become more manageable. And then finally, once the feeling has fallen off a bit, we're ready to take everything into account and make a conscious response, interacting between all those different subsystems of the mind that I was talking about earlier. So this is the ideal way to work through a feeling. And in early childhood, you need your parents to help walk you through these steps and teach you how to do that process. Unfortunately, for many of us, we didn't receive that kind of healthy emotional processing in childhood. In fact, if our parents are not emotionally healthy, our own emotional experiences often cause overwhelm in them. That means they see our feelings as a problem to be solved, and they can respond to that problem in less than helpful ways. Probably the most common example of that kind of response is to shush the child, to say, "It's okay, it's not that bad." And on the surface, this seems like reassurance. It seems like it could be helpful, but it actually works directly against emotional health. First and foremost, kids are perceptive, and they'll pick up on the fact that their big feelings were uncomfortable for their parents. This framing treats the feeling, the crying, as the problem, not the scraped knee. And so the child learns that there's something wrong with having these feelings, and they should work to avoid those kinds of feelings. The child's experience here is also subverted by the "it's not that bad" remark, because the child's experiencing a strong feeling, a sensation in their body around the scrape itself, and then emotions that came up around that. And rather than validating those feelings and experiences, the adult is saying, "Those feelings are wrong. You should not be feeling that way." And the emotionally healthy way to get through this is to fully experience that pain, the fear, the sadness, get to the other side of it, and then through that experience see, "I'm okay now. I got through those feelings. Now I can see it wasn't so bad." But by starting with the message of "it's not that bad," you teach the child to actually deny their own experiences. And those denials might seem fairly innocuous for a scraped knee, but they can lead directly to habits that impact you in adulthood. So going back to that story about Nick and Susan, a habit of denial could easily lead you to feel, when you experience that feeling of anger or wanting to do something about Susan's predicament, you might immediately respond through denial. It wasn't that bad. The remark wasn't that bad. Those are things that you learn in childhood as ways of dealing with strong feelings, and they can stick with you for many, many years. And there are lots of other ways that this can play out. There can be a more direct "don't cry" message, which really puts the focus explicitly on stopping the feeling. And internalizing that message means learning to repress or block your feelings. Another common one is to respond to difficult feelings in the child by offering distractions, right? You scraped your knee, here's a toy or a treat or something to get your mind off of that. That can be a reasonable way to help tolerate feelings in adulthood, but it can also lead to poor emotional health, to habits that say, whenever I feel bad, I'm going to try to get my mind away from that feeling, put it aside, not process it, not listen to it or consciously respond to it, but just focus on something. And so the common theme with all of this is a kind of vicious cycle that we get into that erodes our emotional health and ultimately leads to these experiences of emotions as unpredictable and volatile and disproportionate and irrational. It all starts by focusing on negative emotions as being something dangerous or undesirable or a problem to be solved. And that leads to a kind of cycle, because once you start seeing negative emotions in that light, you start having feelings about feelings. If you were given a message repeatedly in childhood to not cry, then when you experience some profound sadness or struggle in adulthood and you feel tears forming, you might get an additional layer of anxiety or even panic and try to take action to avoid at all costs fully experiencing that sadness. And so that feeling actually compounds the already intense feeling of sadness that you started with, increasing the overall emotional activation. And then at the same time, by treating certain kinds of feelings as things that shouldn't happen to you, that you want to avoid, that are problems, you decrease your overall tolerance to emotion. Right? So on the one hand, you're increasing the total amount of emotion. On the other hand, you're decreasing tolerance. And going back to our definition of emotional health that involves tolerating, listening to, and responding to emotions, all of this makes that a lot more challenging. And so what starts to happen over time as we lose that tolerance, by definition, we're no longer able to be fully aware of our feelings and our responses to them. Because that's really what tolerance means. It's being able to stay with that experience, to be fully conscious of it. Since we can't stay fully conscious of it, again, by definition, we end up unconsciously responding, usually relying on habitual strategies for managing those negative emotions. But notably, those strategies don't tend to actually resolve the underlying feelings or the things in our life that led to having those feelings. And there's a kind of conservation law around feelings, around the energy in the body that feelings produce. Even if we're not aware of all of our feelings, even if we push them out of consciousness, their energy is still there. It still influences us. And that residual energy that we haven't fully metabolized and processed and responded to starts to leak out in ways that look unpredictable and disproportionate. Right? So that's how we get to this bad rap that feelings have, of seeming so out of control, leading to regrettable action, popping out surprisingly, all of this came from trying to avoid or get away from negative experiences in these habitual ways, rather than learning to tolerate, process, and consciously respond to them. So I want to finish this discussion by talking more generally about the kinds of responses that we have to overwhelming experiences that are beyond our tolerance. We were focusing before on childhood, but it's important to understand the kinds of strategies that stay with us through adulthood and become unconscious habits. Those strategies tend to come from instinctive responses to threat. You've probably heard of the fight or flight response, but these days there's a more sophisticated map that includes also freeze and fawn responses, each of these being on a kind of spectrum. I don't have time to go fully in depth into this map, but I'll try to give a few examples of familiar patterns in adulthood that stem from these kinds of instincts. So let's start with flight. It's easy to understand the flight response in a kind of predator-prey situation where you perceive some predator and you're responding by trying to outrun it to get to safety. But for humans, that kind of instinct also plays out in realms that don't involve physical danger, but do involve, in some sense, emotional danger. And that emotional danger is generally social in nature, worrying about what people think about you, how they might be judging you. And that can have very physical ramifications if that could endanger your career or livelihood, etc. So when we think of flight response to those kinds of dangers, it looks like we're trying to somehow outrun judgment. What does that look like? Perfectionism. If we could only make this thing good enough that it couldn't be criticized, then maybe we would be safe from people thinking poorly of us. Of course, the problem is there is no amount of good enough that could ever completely protect against other people's impressions of us. And we will be stuck in a habit of perfection as long as we see that feeling of being judged or its ramifications as intolerable. Perfectionism is a strategy to deal with our lack of tolerance for this difficult emotion of being judged. And so it's not until we can learn to tolerate that negative experience of being judged that we can free ourselves from the strategy of perfectionism. And the flight instinct is also tied to other kinds of strategies, like keeping busy to avoid experiencing negative feelings, or workaholism. Similar story there. Another type of instinctual response is the fawn response. And the idea here is that you're going to try to keep yourself safe by giving the predator or the dangerous thing what it wants. And so there's a kind of trade here of paying more attention to the feelings and experiences of the people around you than your own feelings. That can show up as having a difficulty saying no to things, or generally having poor boundaries about what you're willing to do. It can show up as more proactive people-pleasing, just trying to make people happy with you. And again, this all comes down to a kind of negative experience that you have come to see as intolerable. The idea of someone being upset with you because you're prioritizing some aspect of your own experience, perhaps at the expense of theirs. And it's not until you learn to tolerate that kind of situation emotionally that you can get free of those people-pleasing habits. The last instinct I'll talk about today is the freeze instinct. And you can see this as animals trying to be very still, hiding from the danger, camouflaging themselves, or even playing dead. For humans, this often looks like a sort of shrinking down, hiding parts of yourself from the people around you, isolating from people, narrowing your life activities, or even procrastinating, where we're effectively hiding from some responsibility or thing that we should be doing. And again, with all of these different specific strategies, what's going on under the hood is that there's some kind of negative emotional experience that we've come to believe we can't tolerate, and we're employing these strategies to keep that experience at a distance. Now, a lot more could be said about all of these strategies and their intricacies and the underlying feelings at play. But the broad point I want to make is that these kinds of familiar struggles that many of us have with perfectionism, procrastination, people pleasing, or a number of other things, all of those struggles make sense. There's a reason that things play out this way, even though they can often seem so irrational. Perfectionism, procrastination, people pleasing were all strategies that we used to adapt to our lack of emotional tolerance, or the ways that we viewed negative emotions growing up or through our experiences. But those strategies may no longer be serving you now. And you can learn how to respond to your life in different ways and not be so stuck in these kinds of repeating strategies. The key to making those changes is learning to improve your emotional health. Now, that's not something that I can help you do in the context of a half an hour talk, but I hope that I've piqued your interest, and I want to point you at some resources that you can use to set out on a journey of improved emotional health. One of the basic steps you can take is just to learn more about human psychology and how these things play out. Understand the kind of emotional debt that you can build up over your life and the structure of the mind. As I mentioned before, emotional health is fundamentally social. So building relationships where you can talk about your feelings as you're experiencing them, sort of catching your habits in the act with safe enough friends who can validate them, that can help you learn to improve your tolerance and choose consciously different reactions. Meditation is an important way to generally improve the level of awareness of what's going on in your mind and your ability to tolerate different kinds of mental experiences. And of course, therapy is one of the key ways that you can grow in your knowledge and awareness of all of these things and learn to practice new approaches, again, in a relationship with your therapist. I'll point you at some specific resources for your own education. There are a few books that I mention here. The one I'll specifically call out is Why Do I Do That? It's a book that lays out quite systematically a huge range of different strategies that we employ, where they come from, and how to work on the underlying feelings. There's also a great Pixar movie called Inside Out that gives a really vivid depiction of how the mind works and the implications of shunning negative emotions. Finally, you can follow me on Twitter. I talk about this kind of thing all the time and try to show the inner workings of my own mind and experience. And I always welcome conversation and DMs there. I hope that this talk has helped you reorient yourself towards your own feelings and gotten you curious about how you could improve your own emotional health. I hope that you're able to progress through your own careers with less suffering and greater health than I was able to do. Thank you.
Well, wow. Thank you so much, Aaron, for that very heartfelt and very, very informative talk. I can't thank you enough. Thanks a lot. Are there any questions? I know that we're slightly overrunning, but I think it's important to utilize Aaron while we have him. Are there any questions to Aaron that you'd like to ask? Remember, you can raise your hand, but in the meantime, if there aren't any, then I'll ask a couple questions. So what do you think are some of the early warning signs we should be watching out for in ourselves before the situation gets too out of control or too bad?
I think that starting to notice feelings that seem sort of incongruent with what's going on can be an indication that you've kind of, that harmonious interaction between subsystems has started to break down. And it can take a lot of work to understand where these sort of unexpected feelings are coming from. There can be a lot of layers, but I think that's one of the first signs. So for me, that looked like this kind of background anxiety or dread, this feeling that something bad was going to happen any moment, even though everything seemed fine sort of rationally in my life. And what I chose to do at the time was just kind of keep pushing through it, just push that anxiety down, keep working. But if I had taken note of that incongruous feeling and reached out for help, I might have saved myself a lot of suffering.
Wow, we have a lot of questions now. I'm going to unmute you one by one. Santiago, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Yes, so I have two questions. My first question is, what is dissociation? Because I'm not familiar with this concept or word, and it appears in several of the slides.
Yes. So dissociation is a pretty general term that refers to a kind of separation in the mind. So where there's some phenomenon going in the mind, but you have separated it from conscious awareness or have a sort of split in the mind. And that can take a lot of forms. That can look like just being numb to feelings. So there is a feeling going on, but you've taught yourself to not actually feel it consciously. It can look like a sense of not being in your body, sort of not being real, things like that. It can take a lot of shapes. It's one of the harder things to grasp because it's kind of something missing rather than something that you actively experience.
Okay, thanks. And I have another question. It is just out of curiosity, it's not at all criticism. And my question is, do you have children, or is it just for pedagogical purposes that you took the children raising example? I mean, where does it come from?
So I do have children, but I think more generally, we are wired to learn about how to relate to people and how to relate to our feelings in very early childhood. And it's quite easy as adults to sort of feel like our childhood is irrelevant to us now that we've moved past whatever that was. But the work of unwinding this kind of emotional baggage or legacy code in our minds really has to trace all the way back to childhood to get the full story.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Leila?
Thank you very much for the answers, and thank you very much for the talk.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for the talk. I had one question. How can one balance between or determine whether, oh, that's normal, or it's fine if I'm a bit tired or I'm a bit stressed, I need to push myself harder, and between, oh, I actually have a burnout or something serious is going on? How to determine whether it's this or that?
That is a really important and difficult question that I think is kind of at the heart of learning to live well. And I can't give a complete answer to that, but I know that a really important way to gain that kind of ability is this general emotional tolerance. The more that you're able to feel and look at and process your emotions, the more familiar you become with them. And with that practice, you start to learn what is normal for you, what is not normal, how do you listen to those feelings. So you can gain, as you gain tolerance, you also gain greater sensitivity to your feelings. And your feelings can really tell you a lot. As you learn to listen to them better, you'll start to gain more clarity as to what they're actually telling you. But it's a lifelong journey.
Thank you.
Alex, I've tried to unmute you multiple times. I didn't. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a question about balancing, like feeling your emotions with being productive, because in a sense, when I'm trying to say do research, for example, and I have all these feelings that I'm thinking about and trying to, feel, in a sense, I have to suppress those feelings in order to continue to be productive, right? So what's your recommendation on balancing feelings and productivity in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, and it's interesting, even for me right now, I struggle with this. Sometimes I have residual anxiety that kind of mirrors my past with work. And sometimes I feel like I have to go back and forth between two kinds of work, the sort of technical work I'm trying to do, and then pausing that and working on my emotional self. The thing I would say is, I think we often make a false assumption that we need to put those feelings aside in order to be productive, when in fact, many times it's exactly the other way around. Because our feelings supply us with energy to do anything in our lives, working against those feelings often makes us less productive. And if we could process them, we would actually be more productive. We'd have more energy for what we're doing. That's true in the big scheme of things, as you sort of work through your emotional health in general. But of course, in any particular moment, it might not look that way. Sometimes you do need to put things aside. So I think the other answer is, it's okay to do that sometimes, right? You don't always have to process your emotions as they happen. That's not always possible. But if you have a habit of suppressing them and never coming back and working through them, that's where you can start to drift into mental illness over time.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Travis?
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I guess my own experience of burnout has been this, like, the suppression of those feelings for productivity, but eventually a lack of identification with yourself as like a capable person, right? Like, even now, I don't really see myself as someone capable of writing software, even though evidence does not suggest that's the case. In your own experience of burnout, have you found any good strategies or ways of, I suppose, restoring your own identity without conceptualizing it as like a fixing of something broken?
Great question, and something I'm actively working on right now. I think that the storytelling part that you said at the end is really key. My own story feels like there's this big breakdown, and for a while I had this mentality that now I'm broken and I'm working to fix myself, and that ultimately is not a very empowering story. And so I think you can work with your therapist, you can work with yourself to find a way to tell your story that is more empowering. So for example, the way that I think of things now is, I've always struggled with feelings, but before I was struggling unconsciously, now I'm struggling more consciously. And in that trade-off, I'm less willing to sort of push things aside and work through them. That might look like less productivity right now, but I know I'm on a path toward healing. And sort of having that mentality, giving yourself, some margin, but ultimately seeing this as a healing path where you can be whole, is important and can help you get through burnout. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm sensitive of time here. Happy to talk on Twitter or otherwise about that.
Nikki?
I was wondering how much of the strategies that you've talked about are influenced by attachment theory, and then my second question is, how did you find resources, or like what resources are there for contextualizing these in a more long-term like work environment? Since a lot of these sorts of resources that I've seen similar to these are usually about specific incidents rather than things like.
Could I just suggest, in the interest of time, because there are too many people still wanting to ask questions, could you limit yourself to one question and pick one of these? And then you can always talk to Aaron afterwards. We'll keep the room open.
I guess the latter one. Yeah.
So I think focus. I'm not sure that I fully understand about the focus on specific incidents. One thing that does bring to mind is the importance of trauma as an understanding of what's going on here. And I think PTSD as a sort of reaction to trauma is a well-known thing, but it's based on specific incidents in your life. But this notion of complex PTSD, which I referenced in the slide but didn't talk about, is specifically about ongoing traumatic experiences and the effects that those have. That might be one lens to look at. I mentioned a book on that front that might be helpful. But I'm not sure I totally followed the piece about the work environment.
I mean, like fight, flight, fawn, and I forgot the last one. In the context of like a longer term thing as opposed to like singular, you know, running away from something specifically occurring right now versus flight as like a long term thing, procrastination or overworking, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think the way that I think about that is both by our own temperaments and our life experiences, we have a tendency to lean toward some or the other of those responses and not so much the others. So for example, I have almost a non-existent fight response, you know, and I have a very strong like freeze and fawn response. So I think those are habits. Those are, you know, ways that we repeatedly react to things. And I would again actually point you to that complex PTSD book that talks in depth about those instinctual responses and the habits around them and how to think about that stuff.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And Michael, I've tried to unmute you. I don't know if, no? Okay, so then I'll come back to Michael later, I guess. Let's go to Derek.
Hi. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, Derek.
Thank you very much for that. My question was, at the end of the talk, you mentioned various, I guess, personality traits that, or not personality traits, but things like perfectionism and people pleasing, and these various things which it seemed you were suggesting are things you should basically tone down, or that are symptoms of deeper problems or of deeper, you know, a lack of emotional health. And I've been struggling with a lot of those things myself for a long time. But on the other hand, I also have, one of the troubles I have is figuring out where to draw the line, because in some ways those things seem to me to be also symptoms of positive characteristics. So for example, perfectionism is often a symptom, not a symptom, but a feature of being a very detail-oriented person. People pleasing can be also related to receptiveness to criticism, or caring about what other people actually think. Right. So so I sort of never know myself where to draw the line. Like, when am I going too far in the direction of perfectionism or people pleasing or procrastination? Well, procrastination is maybe less positive, but I mean, you know, the positive symptom of procrastination is you get to, you know, people think you're working very hard on whatever you happen to be working on because you're avoiding doing something else, right? So, I never know how to disentangle these things and figure out like when I'm going too far. I don't know if you figured this out.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In some ways, this is similar to one of the earlier questions about, how do you know when it's a normal thing versus a sign of burnout or things like that. And I know I presented those strategies in a way that might seem a bit black and white, but I think the way that I think about this, that I learned from my therapist, is that these strategies are not inherently good or bad. They can fit a situation or not. The question is more, can you choose? Do you feel like you have control over when you're taking a perfectionistic stance? You know, so for example, yeah, maybe you're detail oriented, but maybe you can rationally recognize, well, this particular thing I'm doing, it's not that important. It's not worth it for me to put that level of attention into it. But if you find that you still have to, that it's compulsive, that's a sign that that strategy has really ossified into this kind of habitual response to emotions. And working to unwind that and get at the underlying feelings can give you greater freedom to pick and choose when you want to give that attention, when you want to please other people versus focusing on your own experience, etc.
Okay.
Michael, I think you finally managed to unmute yourself. Please go ahead and ask some questions.
Yeah, well, I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to say that, as somebody who's been adapting to PTSD since before they gave it a name, it's just, I just love to see somebody evangelizing about it. You know, it's just one of those things where it's like kind of an automatic, you know, brother, I know what you're feeling.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you,
so
Michael.
just thanks for actually coming out and talking about it. You know, it's really hard to do in public. So,
yeah, thank you.
So, thank you, Aaron. I'm very aware of the time. We have already taken so much of your time, but there are still questions if you're happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll end the session. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Christine, please go ahead.
Okay, so the last question, I guess part of your answer to Derek kind of answered it, but it's basically like you mentioned 4 things on the scale. So fight, fawn, other stuff. And you haven't talked about the fight one, which is my default reaction. And since Derek kind of praised the other 2, procrastination and pleasing, I'd go for flight goes with skepticism, which is also kind of something that's required in research. So yeah, so also about that, how was academia versus industry? As in like part of the saying it's someone else's problem?
So first, yeah, I agree that fight is very important. As I said, I didn't talk as much about it, partly for time and partly because it's a very underdeveloped response for me. But there's a lot to be said for it. I think the question of industry versus academia is quite interesting when it comes to mental health. I had this hope that making that shift in my life would solve these problems for me. It did not. I despite the fact that I was able, when I made that shift, to keep my working hours much more constrained, and sort of have healthier boundaries in that respect, I still had that background anxiety and dread. And I think the thing about these habits is once you really get into this mindset of protecting yourself from these certain dangers, your mind has a way of taking those residual feelings and finding a story to explain them in your present circumstances, whether or not that actually makes sense, right? And so in academia, for me, that looked like I must publish all the papers. I must say yes to all of the review requests and so on. I have to do all the things in order to have any chance of survival. I'm in danger. When I transitioned to Mozilla, within the first 6 months, I felt sure that their hiring me was a fluke, and that any day I was going to be fired, despite all of the signs to the contrary. So I don't think these challenges are intrinsic to academia, but I do think that there are some specific things around academia with respect to boundaries that can be a challenge, where there's a kind of mentality of, this is a calling. This is a really special thing that very few people get to do. And therefore, you should be willing to make so many sacrifices, in order to support this special kind of career. And I do think that kind of mentality can pose a danger to a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thanks for that.
For your talk and for all of your answers. This was a great talk, and we touched on a very important topic. And I just wanted to finish on the note saying that, unfortunately, there is still, despite all of our efforts as a community and as a society, there's still quite a bit of stigma attached to discussing mental health and looking after your mental health. So I wanted to finish on asking you, okay, let's say you actually managed to recognize the signs of anxiety or a difficult time in a colleague. Since this is a delicate subject, do you have any advice for, lending a helping hand, or what is there that we can do if you notice anything?
That's a great question. What I've learned over time about relating to other people is that it goes back to what I was saying about emotional tolerance being social in the first place. So I think far more important than raising their awareness or giving advice or trying to fix the problems, the best thing you can do is just listen to them, validate what they're feeling, echo it back to them. No more, no less. That kind of thing, can build a sense of safety and trust in the relationship. And then maybe much later, after that's established, they might ask, do you have ideas about how to deal with this? Or, there might be an opportunity to bring things into scope. But I think, I know for myself, for a long, long time, whenever somebody was telling me something about their own experiences, something negative, it made me uncomfortable because I had poor emotional tolerance, and my reaction, just like the parents I was talking about, was to try to fix my discomfort by making their feelings go away, by trying to fix their problems for them. And that's almost never a helpful response. Just listening, validating, and echoing back is the most helpful thing you can do.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was a great session. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, but the Zoom room will remain open since this is the last talk of PLMW. We saved the best for last. So Aaron, feel free to stick around, please, but we don't feel obliged to at all. We've taken so much of your time, but everyone else, please feel free to stay back, you know, socialize, whatever. I need to dash off to SRC, unfortunately, but I am going to, Stephanie, if that's okay with you, I'm going to transfer the role of the host to you.
Unfortunately, I have a meeting coming up in 8 minutes. So can anyone else, because it's Zoom, otherwise I would be happy to run, but I cannot